India is a civilization with a history that is thousands of years old. The diversity of India, of our civilization, is actually a thing of beauty. On that context, we request Prafulla Ketkar, editor of Organizer, and Harsh Madhusudhan, author and economist, to come over on the stage, and Surendranath, who is a software engineer, who is very much interested in Indic and ancient Indian civilization, to discuss on the topic, Long India Civilizational Renewal. Welcome, panel.
And a warm welcome to one and all for the first session today. So as a topic, we chose upon Long India, a civilizational revival. And it's also pretty thematic in that Harshji is planning a book, upcoming book on the same topic. And one of the things we thought we will talk about is to look at India, Long India, not just from the perspective of stocks and investment and economic revival, but also from the perspective of a long-term civilizational, social, economic, and cultural revival of India. So, since economics and economy is closely intertwined with cultural and intangible social factors, so let me just open the discussion by asking Harshji first about this aspect of his book.
Thank you so much, Surenji. Thank you to the Chennai Litfest. Thank you to Bharatji and the entire organizing team. Thank you to Prafulla ji for sharing the stage. Yes, my next book, my third book, is Long India. That is in an economic sense, but here we are discussing in a broader sense. See, if we take India's per capita income as a percentage of the leading Western per capita income, it has been falling for about 1,000 years. And the numbers are obviously not perfect, not precise, but that's the rough scholarly estimate right now, especially if you do an India to UK comparison. It's also the rough time when we lost our state. We also lost our political independence. So I think the big picture I want to first open with, Surenji, here is that a civilization without a state, it's like a body without a backbone. It's like a jellyfish. Now the jellyfish can survive in a particular way at a particular equilibrium. It cannot survive beyond that. And what happened was, without relitigating why we got colonized, and by colonized I don't just mean British colonialism, I also mean, in a broader sense, Turkic colonialism. Without relitigating why that happened, once that happened, we got into a very low-level equilibrium where, I would not use the Chinese phrase of a century of humiliation. I would call it the millennial of both humiliation and heroism. So if there was both humiliation and heroism, we fought back, but we got into a low-level equilibrium where certain defense mechanisms kicked in, the way our society was organized, which prevented further large-scale conversions, but could not lead us to political independence. Now, what happened in 1947, as the state system started globalizing, and now we have, on top of our ancient civilization, we have a very young and modern state, is that for the first time, we are in a situation where we can be proactive in the world, first time in 1,000 years, not before that, and not just reactive. So the starting point is the fact that we got our own state, covering all of what is now India, ignoring the parts that are now Pakistan and Bangladesh, in 1,000 years is of massive geostrategic, geoeconomic, geocivilizational significance. And the book I would often think about that is Girilal Jain's The Hindu Phenomenon, right? In one stroke, we got rid of the British and earlier Turkic colonialists, and in a way partition, as incomplete as it was to some extent, also got rid of the dynasty or successor state of Mughal India in the form of Islamic Pakistan. So now what we are doing right now in the last 75 years is we are learning how to rule ourselves again. Some mistakes were inevitable, as we no doubt did for 30, 40 years. We are trying to correct those mistakes. So what is a state? State is nothing but a form of Sanghatan. State is nothing form of Sanghatan, where you can actually pool resources together to have a common army, You can pool resources together to create irrigation, roads, to create prosperity that small people in their private enterprise cannot coordinate. It is a coordination mechanism. So in that sense, the Indian Sangha and the Hindu identity, which has come out as an umbrella identity, which is per force a political identity, per force a meta-political identity, not in a party sense, is very, very new in a 1,000-year sense. And we are all basically, I think we are now understanding it better, and in the next 20, 30 years, the world will understand it better.
That's an interesting perspective. Prafulla ji, I wish to bring you in from a totally different context. In the sense that there were a couple of interesting observations where Harshji said that after 1,000 years we have our own state, and the intermediary phases were those of resistance. So how would you view that? Would you view the Maratha Confederacy and the Vijayanagar Empire themselves as symbols of resistance alone, or as a proto-Indian state or a pre-modern Indian state in itself?
See, Soren, fortunately for last 2-3 years, I had got a chance to go through many documents related to, in a way, pre-British India, and even during the freedom struggle. What I found interesting is our resistance to British or European colonialism was very different from the resistance to Islamic invasion. And the primary reason for that was perhaps the instruments of colonization themselves were different. Portuguese, Dutch, when they came, and as we have seen especially in this part of India, the Portuguese invasion was much more brutal and open like the Islamic invasion. They were quite clear what they wanted to achieve out of it. Compared to that, the British colonization was much more shrewd and subtle. And for them, the instruments were more legal, educational, and economic. So, if you see the trajectory of our freedom movement, initially it started with Swadharma, but eventually, as the instruments of colonization changed, our response to this colonization process also changed. So, Swadharma was added with Swadeshi, then Swabhasha and Rashtriya Shiksha, national education and self-language. And only in the last phase we revived the idea of Swaraj, that is the political control. Civilizationally, I find this argument very problematic, and I see this more as a European construct, that state is an inevitable condition to control and manage your resources. It is just, and yesterday we were together in some meeting, and we discussed there that it is only after the Westphalian thing that this entire idea of nation state evolved. What India had, and yesterday also I mentioned in one of the sessions, and I would like especially the youngsters to think over this. Civilizationally, I feel that India was always a unified Rashtra, but a decentralized state mechanisms as per the need and the resources. British tried to reverse it by creating a centralized state and a divided nation. Divided on the European constructs either of language or religion. Both language and religion as the basis of nation state is a European construct. And unfortunately, we see entire modern discourse revolving around that European idea of nation state. And that's why we find it problematic, and we try to draw certain parallels whether, we were really state or not, or unified or not, whether for India it hardly matters who is the ruler. Whether that ruler is righteous or not was more important. Whether that, otherwise for us, sitting here in Tamil Nadu, or earlier Madras province, or Chola or Pandya or Calicut kingdom or Kochi kingdom or whatever this land comes under. For us, Kashi was Kashi, Ganga was Ganga, Himalaya was Himalaya. The sanctity and sacredness of those places never changed. The idea of unified Rashtra never changed. Now that's why in between what we search for doesn't make much sense to the common people today, because we are seeing everything from the interestingly, and I would like Harsh to go through sometimes those legal documents where Maratha Confederacy has created a separate code, legal code. It's a sort of constitution. Similarly, there were many kingdoms, the Mysore kingdom, even Maharaja Hari Singh, they had their own constitutional things. And the kind of taxation policy, the kind of land policy, the kind of educational thing, the kind of policies related to women, if you see them, they are much more so-called progressive and modern, if we really want to use those terms. But unfortunately, we don't take them as reference points. And that's why understanding, and I am glad that Harsh, after talking about his new idea of India, now talking about long India. Now, in fact, he is the right person to take this forward. How does this new India finds, its bearing in the long India? How it is going to unfold itself in the changed situation when we had so much of baggage, not just about invasion, about this confusion whether we are state or not, or nation or not, but more about the colossal damage that we have faced due to, a couple of ideas that he has discussed in his book, in a new idea of India called Socialism and Secularism. It is still carries that kind of sanctity, despite losing entire relevance either politically or economically. So in that sense, it is going to be a challenge. For us, the state was always secular, and as I said, nation cannot be secular. It will always be cultural. It will always be civilizational. So how to put that in Indic terms, make it understandable to everybody, whether a Tamil speaking or a Bengali speaking person, that is going to be the real challenge. And perhaps English speaking population and mere English idioms perhaps will not help us in doing that. So we will have to develop certain mechanism about conveying those right meaning with right connotation, and we have to create our own terminology to explain and really incarnate that dharmic state with civilizational wisdom. That is what I feel.
That's an interesting perspective, Prafulji. Now your talk and you touched upon Swadeshi, and that's an economic aspect, and that's where I would like to take off and invite Harsh to make a few comments. So in the Swadeshi way of thinking, and you said that Swadeshi brings up images of autarky and closed economies and so on, protectionism and so on. But I would like to, at this context, I would like to invoke one of our great civilizational thinkers, whose picture is here right behind us. In one of his poems, he says, we will give the ivory of Kerala as prize for the bravery of the Marathas. We will build a bridge to Sri Lanka, and ஆலைகள் செய்வோம், தொழிற்சாலைகள் செய்வோம். We will build schools, we will renovate our temples, and we will build factories. So that is a view of Swadeshi, which is very much in the Indian, civilizational ethos. And I would call upon Harsh at this point to give his perspectives on, what is our view of Swadeshi and economic growth versus actual socialist autarky.
So, thank you, Suren. Just quick comments on what Prafulla ji said. I think one way to put that is, we are Hindu Rashtra, Hindi Rajya. Hindi is, it can have wrong connotations. So Indian Bharatiya Rajya, Dharmik Rajya, but Hindu Rashtra. And secularism has often been defined in our sense rightly as being Panth Nirpeksh. You cannot be Dharm Nirpeksh. So that makes it very clear instantly that you're not favoring one sampradaya over the other. You are simply saying you'll be neutral to sampradayas. In that sense, we were always a secular state, as you rightly mentioned. I think one area where I'll slightly disagree is that, which actually connects to the point on economic nationalism or what our view is. Without a state, and a state by definition has to be somewhat centralized. This is one of the reasons why we rejected the cabinet mission plan in 1946. One of the best things that Jawaharlal Nehru did was he did a press conference and said we are not bound by the cabinet mission plan. And therefore the partition happened in that given context. Is that the state, if it is not, has the centralized Sangathan capabilities, organizing capabilities. You cannot, for example, as you're discussing off stage, connect rivers. You cannot build irrigation canal. You cannot build infrastructure, which actually leads to productivity, prosperity, and then the spreading of dharma outside of your borders as well. I think what happened is we did not care, that is true, who was the Rajyam so long as he was righteous. But most of the time when they were not in a Hindu dharmic mold, they were not righteous. Instead of patronizing temples, they were taxing temples. And it became very difficult, therefore, so I think going to a self-sufficient village economy was a defense mechanism, where people were following their caste professions, they were doing this, because that was a very stable equilibrium, but nothing beyond that equilibrium. So now, when the world is growing into larger and larger polities, empires, nation states, the nation state itself is a result of post-Abrahamic Westphalian 1648 compact, and now we are in a way Westphalian 2.0. Once the other person has economies of scale in terms of state size and armies, there is no other option for us but to have that, if nothing else as a response. Because Kashi was always there, but today Sharda is not safe. Sharda is technically right now in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Mulasthana, what is now Multan, is not safe. There are Hindu places of worship in Balochistan which are not safe. To some extent, unfortunately, even in Bangladesh. So actually, without the kavach of the state, it becomes very difficult to defend the society. And on that very brief point, before I go to the economic angle, I agree the Shivaji Maharaj, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj represented a proto-modern Indian state. But eventually the Maratha Empire could not actually win over the northern Indian plains. They were perhaps the preponderant power, but somebody like Ahilyabai Holkar, made the Kashi Vishwanath Mandir next to the masjid. She could not actually did what we did with Somnath in 1947 and Ayodhya right now, because the local Hindus only said that, your power is temporary and transient here, the Marathas. If when you go, we'll have repercussions. And I think that was one of the reasons was the state, there was no internal way of organizing. Democracy is one way that we are doing it right now successfully. Whereas for Abrahamic religions, in the case of Islam, Islam was the binding glue, despite their internal dissensions. And in the case of post-Christian European states, the Westphalian state was the organizing glue. So for us, we are not a European nation state, we are a civilizational state. We have multilingual, but that thing is there. How does that connect to economics? It connects to economics because we want to use the economies of scale of size without letting the diseconomies of size affect us. That is the broad concept. Now, what does that mean? It means that right now when the world is going through a massive war, pandemic, financial global crisis, the reason Sri Lanka and to some extent Pakistan and other countries, many African countries cannot do well is they just do not have the size and the weight. In India, what is happening, we are saying if you want to manufacture cell phones, we can import it with a 10-15% import tariff, which is not autarky as Suren rightly mentioned. But you know what, you don't even have to pay the 10-15%. In fact, we might give you some PLI subsidy. If you manufacture it in India, with the carrot of this massive domestic market, or more accurately, the potential of the massive domestic market as the ultimate carrot. So I think that the fact that we, in a way, the civilization, the state and the economy, they all converge here because civilization is what kept us together. On top of that, we've put a state which is different from a European state, but nonetheless a reaction to it, I agree. That in turn is giving us the scale to kickstart economic growth, which to be fair, Nehruvian socialism in the 1950s honestly tried. In the 1960s and especially under Indira Gandhi, it devolved into corruption and what we now call import substitution Raj because of a fixed exchange rate, etc. But the early 1950s attempt at Nehruvian socialism, just to be intellectually honest, import substitution by itself was not a problem. The problem was that we had a fixed currency, and because the rupee became uncompetitive because of higher inflation and we did not have floating currency rates at that time, to prevent massive imports, we started putting licenses, and then that built up a constituency of corruption within the politicians and the bureaucrats and the technocrats. So the initial idea was not wrong. Now under Narendra Modi's leadership, we are doing it the right way. We are building up reserves, we have the floating exchange rate, we have education, human capital, infrastructure, but we are still saying we will not go by the IMF World Bank route blindly. We are not Singapore. We have a certain benefit in scale and size without making it inefficient, because that PLI is also applicable to a Korean company. It is also applicable to an American company. It is not only for Indian companies, and therefore it is not protectionism. It is simply saying if you can create local jobs, if you can create some value added inside our borders, then you have this slight advantage. And that slight advantage compounded over time makes all the difference.
That's again a very interesting macroeconomic perspective, and investors and economists like Harsh are usually more concerned about wealth generation, while intellectuals and thinkers like Prafulla are more concerned about wealth redistribution. So could you just give us some insights on wealth distribution model of Antyodaya versus socialism and autarky?
I'll have to come back to where I left. See, when I say we had a decentralized state, I mean to say we had a more decentralized models of governance. When it comes to defense, when it comes to communication, when it comes to even finance and currency, we need to have something centralized. That is for sure. And that was perhaps one of the reasons that we could not, despite having so much of resistance to colonial aggression, despite one attempt, besides one attempt by Arya Chanakya and in the form of Chandragupta, perhaps we didn't try it later to have something which is more centralized. But the difference when you are talking about the idea of socialism, for me, socialism is basically another form of capitalism.
Interesting.
Socialism is another form of capitalism, means it just replaces individuals with state. But the wealth creation and the production model is essentially exploitative in another form, controlling in another form. So you are actually losing individual creativity, and you tell me a single model. Means if you want to call China socialism, then, I don't know. But Cuba, Soviet Union, you tell me one single model where we can say communism is a successful model of either wealth creation or distribution. It's neither nor. So, now, yes, to some extent we were more, defensive, self-sustainable village economy, but at the same time we were export-oriented economy. So we had different kind of consortiums, we had different kind of clusters. Now, but those clusters were more decentralized in the sense, like in Tamil Nadu, this Tirupur model is a cluster model, classic cluster model. In Gujarat, Bharuch or Morbi is a classic cluster model. In UP, Moradabad is a classic cluster model. Even Kannauj. You know, every household you will find some industry. Every household, entire family is involved. Human resource is optimally utilized. State is there to facilitate, neither to extract nor to impose. To facilitate. The Antyodaya model doesn't just extract and give it to anybody. It empowers everybody to maximize the potential. Antyodaya is not to make somebody state dependent, but making him in fact self-reliant so that next time he becomes a giver rather than taker from somebody. That is the idea of Antyodaya. And that's why you see there will be subsidies that will be directly transferred, but at the same time there will be, you know, some kind of empowerment which is more sustainable. If you have a household, if you have a gas connection, you have more stable life. You have better time to utilize in something else which is much more productive. And in that sense, there is a possibility that by next generation, you don't have to be state dependent. Less and less state dependent is the right Indian model. Does that mean it leads to individualism and capitalism? No. It is more a cooperative and communitarian model where family and the society is at the center, state is the facilitator. It is not individual versus collective, it is individual through collective. It is individual empowerment through collective sense of ownership of resources, but not controlled by the state, owned by the community, run by the community as per their needs. That is the right model that we should strive for. And in that sense, we have to balance between this. See, there the fundamental problem is, in the Western world, the essential idea is either there is individual freedom or collective social order. They are perpetually in conflictual mode. So either this or that. We are saying, as a dharmic society, we are saying we can ensure maximum individual freedom up to mukti through a collective model. And nobody says this in the world. And somebody must have said this earlier, but perhaps those civilizations are not existing today. Because the entire world got divided during the Cold War between the communist bloc and the capitalist bloc. So there is no third way. We are the people who have legacy, conviction, and now capacity to provide that third way to the world, which is more sustainable, which is balanced between collective and individual, which is balanced between environmental protection and still economic progress, which is balanced between individual freedom and social order, which is balanced between ideation and still very, I should say, judicious use of technology, so spiritualization of technology. So all this balancing is possible only in a dharmic and civilizational society, and that is our civilizational role that we have to perform in the coming time. And there I think Harsh's books become very, very relevant and important.
That was a fantastic exposition of our model and the third way, the Indian way. And someday I should have a long conversation with you about Thengadi ji and his thoughts and so on. So with that, we'll move on to the next session. And I'm really grateful for both of you gentlemen for having graced the stage.
I would like Harsh to speak about his next book, and is it going to be a sort of sequel to A New Idea of India,
Yes.
or it is going to be a...
This one, thank you so much. I'll very briefly speak since the next session is here. The next book is primarily focused on economics. It's Long India. And the reason why it is relevant for this session, I would say, is, when we often talk about we got political independence, but we are still using the Western or some other frame. And I think one factor we miss out on that is, which you mentioned in the very end, was capacity. So what happens is, even when India became free, the mental metropole was in New York and London. Because the think tanks had money there, the academia was well funded there, and to be somebody in your field, you had to be somebody there. Now, what we are seeing gradually, and actually the Chennai Litfest is a very good example of that, because till 10 years ago, there was only one Litfest in India, the Jaipur Litfest, and we all know who controls that. So that's a small example of how we are taking back our own narrative. And The Economist had a very interesting piece yesterday bemoaning the success of IPL, the Indian Premier League, that India is totally dominating cricket. So I would simply conclude by saying that in this book, what I'm trying to say, that India is the world's biggest growth opportunity and investment opportunity, maybe the world's largest economy by or before 2047. But this is a sign of things to come, not just in the material realm, but in the narrative realm, because the two are reflexive. Just like we are now dominating in cricket, it's a premonition of what we will dominate in the realm of ideas, and there we can make a contribution. Thank you.
And Shri D.V. Sridharan to come up on the stage to felicitate the panel.